The ocean
Fine
was
day for
silent,
it.
but
Aye,
history
couldn't be
was
better.
not.
The
A
water's
young
like
boy
glass.
looked back at Ireland and did not know if he would ever see home again. For years, people argued about his
Come on,
story.
get up.
Was he a
Trying.
slave or something
We have to
history
move.
forgot to
All right, I'm
explain?
up.
The ocean was dark, endless, and heavy with secrets no one wanted to remember. A wooden ship moved slowly through violent waves, its body shaking like it carried the weight of 1,000 broken dreams. The wind screamed through torn sails, ropes creaked, and somewhere below the deck, quiet voices whispered prayers that never reached the sky. A young Irish boy stood near the edge, small hands gripping the rough wood, eyes red from salt, fear, and sleepless nights. He did not understand politics, or empires, or the arguments that future generations would fight over. He only knew that his home was disappearing behind him, swallowed by mist, and that the world ahead felt colder than the ocean itself. Behind him, families sat silently. Mothers holding children, fathers staring into nothing. People who once had farms, songs, and warm fires now reduced to numbers on a ship's record. Some were prisoners of war, some were forced by hunger. Others signed contracts they could not read, believing promises that sounded like hope but felt like chains. Years later, people would argue about what to call them: workers, servants, prisoners, slaves. Words would become weapons, and history would turn into a battlefield. But in this moment, on this dark ocean, there were no labels, only fear, exhaustion, and the quiet sound of hearts breaking with every wave. The boy watched the horizon, wondering if freedom was waiting, or if another prison stood on the other side of the sea. His mother whispered stories about home, green fields, warm bread, and laughter that once filled their nights. But even she knew those memories were already fading, replaced by uncertainty and silence. And as the ship disappeared into darkness, history began to write a story that would confuse generations. A story of suffering, misunderstanding, and a question that still echoes today. Were these people slaves, or something history never fully explained? The truth, like the ocean, was deep, complicated, and often hidden beneath waves of emotion, politics, and time. The journey across the Atlantic was not heroic. It was slow, painful, and uncertain. Food was limited, water tasted like rust, and disease spread through crowded spaces where hope struggled to survive. Many passengers did not know their destination, only that someone else controlled their future. Contracts were mentioned, promises were made, but most could not read the fine lines that defined their lives. Some believed they would work for a few years, earn freedom, and build new lives. Others felt they had already lost everything, and that survival was the only goal left. Days blended into nights. Storms turned the ship into a prison of noise and fear, and every wave felt like a reminder that they were trapped between past and future. When land finally appeared, it did not look like salvation. Harsh heat, strange landscapes, and unfamiliar languages greeted them. Work began almost immediately. Fields stretched endlessly. Overseers watched carefully, and mistakes were punished with strict discipline that made many question whether freedom would ever come. Historians today explain that many Irish arrivals were indentured servants. They signed contracts, usually lasting several years, in exchange for transportation or debt repayment. On paper, this meant their labor had an end date. Some eventually completed their terms, gained land, or started families, but life inside those contracts was often brutal. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and little protection created an environment where survival was never guaranteed. Some died before finishing their service. Others faced punishments that felt harsh and unfair to the people living through it. The difference between a contract and a chain sometimes felt invisible. This is where modern confusion grows. Social media posts and emotional stories began claiming that Irish people were the first slaves in America, The idea spread quickly because it touched deep feelings about forgotten suffering. Many families wanted their ancestors' pain to be recognized, and the story gave them a powerful voice. Yet historians studying legal records, colonial laws, and economic systems explain important differences. African slavery in the Americas became a permanent system based on race, where people and their children were treated as lifelong property. Irish indentured servants, despite harsh treatment, usually had contracts that ended, allowing at least the possibility of freedom. Acknowledging this difference does not erase Irish suffering. It does not make their pains smaller or less real. Many lived through terrifying conditions, forced labor, and years of fear. Their voices deserve to be remembered with honesty, compassion, and accuracy. Imagine again the young boy, older now, hands hardened by work, memories of Ireland fading with time. Maybe he survived his contract. Maybe he built a small life in a new land. Or maybe his story ended quietly, lost among thousands of forgotten names. He did not know historians would debate his identity. He only knew that he endured, and that survival required strength beyond his years. The real tragedy of history is not only what happened, but how easily stories become simplified. People want clear answers, simple labels, heroes and villains, but the past rarely fits into neat categories. The Atlantic world was a place of harsh labor systems, economic desperation, and human suffering that touched many different groups in different ways. Today, understanding this history requires patience. It means listening to multiple perspectives, reading beyond viral headlines, and respecting the complexity of human experiences. It means honoring Irish indentured servants for their struggles, while also recognizing the unique and brutal system of racial slavery that shaped generations of African families. The boy's story, and the stories of thousands like him, remind us that history is not a competition of pain. It is a collection of human lives, each filled with fear, courage, hope, and survival. Their journeys deserve to be told with care, without exaggeration, and without forgetting the truth hidden between emotional narratives. As the sun sets over the ocean, imagine that same ship fading into the horizon, carrying stories that still echo today. Some people will continue to argue over definitions, others will search for identity. But the quiet truth remains. These were real human beings, not just words in a debate. Their suffering mattered, their survival mattered, and understanding their story honestly, without distortion, is the greatest respect we can give them. History is not just about what happened. It is about how we choose to remember, how we listen, and how we learn from the past without losing our humanity. And maybe the real truth history hides is not a single label, but the fragile human stories waiting behind centuries of silence, asking only to be understood, not argued over, but remembered with honesty, dignity, and care. The sun burned differently in the Caribbean, heavier, sharper, like it carried its own silent warning. A wooden ship approached the island slowly, its passengers weak from the journey, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, hearts uncertain about what waited on land. The ocean behind them was endless, but the shore ahead felt even more unknown. A young Irish man stood near the rail, staring at the green hills rising from the water. Palm trees moved gently in the wind, beautiful from a distance, but something in the air felt tense, unfamiliar, and unforgiving. Around him, families gathered their few belongings, mothers holding children close, fathers whispering promises they were not sure they could keep. The ship docked, ropes dropped, and voices shouted orders in accents many could barely understand. One by one, they stepped onto land, feet touching soil that would soon become their world, their workplace, and for some, their final resting place. People back home believed they were traveling toward opportunity, toward new beginnings. But as the gates of the plantation opened, reality arrived quickly. As the tropical heat pressing against their skin. Fields stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, rows of sugarcane sharp enough to cut unprotected hands, overseers watching every movement with strict attention. The work began immediately. There was no time to recover from the ocean, no time to understand the new world. Labor was constant, sunrise to sunset, and exhaustion became a permanent companion. The Caribbean looked like paradise, but for many, it felt like survival inside a storm that never ended. Dreams of freedom echoed in their minds, while reality tested every ounce of strength they had left. And in the middle of those endless fields, a question slowly formed. How long would this life last, and would freedom ever arrive? Life on the plantations was harsh and demanding. The heat drained energy quickly, tools were heavy, and mistakes brought punishment that reminded workers how little control they had over their own time. Contracts existed, but many did not fully understand their terms, and some felt trapped inside agreements that seemed endless. Disease spread easily in crowded living areas. Unfamiliar climates weakened already tired bodies, and many workers struggled simply to survive each season. Letters home were rare, and news from Ireland felt like distant echoes from another life. Historians today describe many Irish arrivals in the Caribbean as indentured servants, people bound by contracts to work for a number of years. Some hoped to complete their service, earn land, and rebuild their lives. A few succeeded, managing to survive the difficult years and eventually move into different roles within colonial society. But survival was never guaranteed. The combination of harsh climate, demanding labor, and strict discipline made the Caribbean one of the most dangerous places for indentured workers. Many never finished their contracts, their stories ending quietly, far from the homes they once knew. As time passed, stories of these struggles began to circulate. Generations later, people would look back and ask whether these Irish workers were actually slaves. The suffering felt real, the conditions felt brutal, and to those living through it, freedom often felt very far away. Yet historians studying laws and records explain important differences. Indentured servants, including many Irish workers, usually had contracts with an end date. While the work was harsh and treatment could be severe, the legal system recognized the possibility of freedom after years of service. In contrast, African slavery in the Caribbean became a lifelong system based on race, where people and their children were treated as permanent property. Understanding this difference does not lessen Irish suffering, but it helps explain why historians use different terms when describing these systems. Imagine again that young Irish man in the fields, sweat mixing with dust, hands aching from endless labor. Every sunset felt like a small victory. Another day survived, another step closer to the possibility of freedom. Around him, friendships formed, quiet acts of kindness appeared, people supporting each other through shared hardship. Hope, even in small amounts, became the most valuable possession they had. Some dreamed of finishing their contracts, starting small farms, and building lives that honored the sacrifices they had made. Others simply hoped to see another sunrise, another chance to endure. As decades passed, memories of the Caribbean experience became stories told to children and grandchildren. Stories of courage, suffering, and survival, but also stories that sometimes changed with time, growing simpler, more dramatic, easier to share. In modern conversations, the debate over whether Irish workers were slaves gained attention online. Emotional posts spread quickly, mixing real pain with misunderstandings about historical definitions. Many people shared these stories because they wanted recognition, respect, and acknowledgement of forgotten struggles. But history asks us to look deeper. to read original documents, to listen to historians, and to understand that suffering can exist in different forms without being identical. Recognizing the complexity of the past allows us to honor every life honestly, without comparison, and without distortion. As the Caribbean sun set over endless fields, the young Irish worker looked toward the horizon, imagining a future beyond contracts, beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Maybe freedom would arrive, maybe it would not, but his story, like thousands of others, became part of a larger human journey shaped by survival, resilience, and hope. Today, when we look back at those islands, we see more than plantations and ships. We see human beings who faced extraordinary challenges, who struggled against harsh conditions, and who left behind stories that deserve to be remembered with care and accuracy. The truth is not always simple. The Caribbean experience was brutal for many Irish indentured servants, yet it existed within a broader system that included different forms of labor, each with its own laws, realities, and long-term consequences. Understanding this past is not about comparing pain, but about listening carefully, learning honestly, and remembering every life with dignity. The young man who stepped onto that island did not know historians would debate his story. He only knew that survival required strength, courage, and the hope that one day, freedom might feel real again. And as the waves continued to touch the shore, carrying echoes of ships long gone, the truth remained hidden between myths and memories, waiting for those willing to look beyond simple answers and see the full human story behind the Caribbean sun. The morning sun barely pierced through the thick smoke rising from the distant fields. The Caribbean heat pressed down on every living thing, and the cries of workers echoed faintly in the distance, carried by the wind that smelled of salt, sweat, and dust. A young Irishman stood at the edge of the clearing, hands trembling, clothes torn, eyes searching for any hint of familiarity. He had survived the ocean, the ship, and the unforgiving plantations. But what lay ahead was a new kind of challenge, one that tested both body and spirit. Around him the landscape stretched endlessly, sugarcane swaying in a relentless rhythm, overseers moving with watchful eyes, and the occasional distant shout breaking the monotony of labor. Families huddled together for comfort, whispering prayers in a language that seemed distant in both time and place. Some whispered of home, of Ireland, of the small villages left behind. Others had lost the very memory of what home felt like, replaced instead by the constant need to survive, one exile, sting day at a time. Every step into the plantation fields was a step into uncertainty. The young man's back ached, hands raw from the tools he carried, sweat dripping into the soil that would become both his prison and his lifeline. Life was measured in moments of endurance, the ability to withstand the scorching sun, the fatigue that threatened to collapse his body, and the ever-present awareness that a single misstep could mean punishment. Yet amidst the hardship, small moments of humanity emerged, a shared glance between workers, a quiet act of kindness, the fleeting reassurance that someone else endured alongside him. Historians today describe this experience as the life of an indentured servant. It was not the same as racial slavery, yet it carried its own brutality. Contracts promised eventual freedom, yet they rarely accounted for the harsh reality of disease, exhaustion, and the relentless demands of the overseers. The distinction may seem clear on paper, but for the young man each day felt like a battle against forces beyond his control. Stories of survival began to take shape among the workers themselves. Older men shared advice, teaching younger ones how to navigate the impossible demands of the day. Mothers whispered to children about hope and resilience, about endurance and faith. Each story, each whispered word, was a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting them to their humanity in a world designed to strip it away. Meanwhile, back in Europe, letters and news of the Caribbean's conditions filtered slowly. Families imagined distant lands with sugar plantations and thriving economies, unaware of the daily struggle and peril faced by those who had been sent across the Atlantic. It was a world where life and labor were commodified, yet human stories, courage, despair, and resilience persisted, quietly, waiting to be remembered. Modern social media and internet narratives often blur these histories, sometimes claiming that Irish workers were slaves, sometimes arguing over terminology and legality. The reality is more nuanced. They endured extreme hardship, yet their situation differed legally and socially from African slavery, which became a permanent, hereditary system based on race. Recognizing these differences does not diminish their suffering. It clarifies the historical landscape, allowing their experiences to be honored without distortion. Imagine the young man pausing as he looks over the endless fields at sunset, the heat finally giving way to the cooler evening breeze. He has endured storms at sea, endless labor, separation from family, and the uncertainty of freedom. Every step, every breath, every whispered hope carries the weight of survival. His story, like thousands of others, is one of courage and resilience, a testament to the human spirit navigating forces far beyond its control. As night falls, the plantation settles into an uneasy quiet. The young man rests briefly, reflecting on the distance between the life he knew and the one he now inhabits. Behind him, shadows of other workers stretch long, a silent reminder of shared endurance. Each face tells a story of hardship, of adaptation, and of the fragile persistence of hope. The truth of this history is not simple. It is a tapestry of struggle, endurance, and survival, often lost between the lines of modern interpretations. To understand it fully requires patience, attention, and a willingness to recognize the complexity of human lives. The young man's journey, like the thousands who accompanied him, reminds us that history is lived by individuals, shaped by circumstance, and preserved through the courage to endure. And as the stars emerge over the Caribbean night, one cannot help but feel the weight of centuries of hidden stories. The sun will rise again, the fields will endure, and the young man's quiet resilience will echo across time, an unspoken testament to survival, hope, and the human capacity to withstand even the harshest of worlds. The sky was heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the plantation like a living thing. Every breeze carried the scent of salt from the distant ocean and the earthy aroma of sugar cane, mingling with the faint cries of workers in the fields. A young Irishman wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle deep into his bones. He had survived the ship, the ocean, and the uncertainty of arrival. Yet the days here tested him in ways he could never have imagined. The plantation stretched endlessly before him, a labyrinth of green under the relentless sun. Overseers moved through the rows with watchful eyes, correcting every misstep, demanding perfection that seemed impossible under the oppressive heat. His hands ached from the heavy tools he carried, the calluses forming faster than he could ignore them, a permanent map of struggle etched into his skin. Around him, other workers trudged silently, faces streaked with sweat and dirt, each step a testament to endurance. Cinematic killer hook, first 5 to 7 seconds. The sun burned hot, but the weight of history was heavier. Ever, why footstep across these fields echoed stories no one wanted to tell, stories of survival, endurance, and the quiet human spirit trapped in systems that seemed impossible to escape. The young man remembered whispers of home, green hills, cozy cottages, laughter of family, but those images faded quickly against the stark reality. Each day was measured in survival, the first light of dawn signaling endless labor, the scorching midday sun pressing down like a relentless judge, and the slow retreat of evening offering only the briefest reprieve before the work would begin again the next day. Life on the plantation was not only physically taxing, but mentally exhausting. The knowledge that freedom was promised on paper, but uncertain in practice, weighed on every mind. Many tried to calculate the years they needed to endure, some hoping to gain land, some dreaming of families they might one day create. Others simply hoped to survive another week, another month, another year. Historians describe these experiences as indentured servitude, but that term can feel distant when faced with the lived reality of the Caribbean fields. Contracts existed, yes, but the enforcement of rules, the harsh punishments, and the ever-present danger of disease and fatigue made the line between servitude and slavery feel almost invisible to those living it. For many Irish workers, survival itself became an act of resistance, a daily struggle to maintain dignity in a world that sought to strip it away. Small moments of humanity persisted, though they were fragile and fleeting. A shared loaf of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, a quiet gesture of solidarity among workers. All were small lifelines against the relentless machinery of labor. These gestures were proof that even in systems designed to dehumanize, people could still find ways to nurture hope, courage, and connection. The young man observed the children around him, some barely older than himself, carrying loads far heavier than their small bodies should manage. He saw the determination in their eyes, the silent resilience that mirrored his own, and felt the bitter truth of what it meant to be caught between survival and despair. These children were part of a larger story that history often oversimplified. Stories reduced to numbers, labels, or myths in distant textbooks and online debates. Modern narratives sometimes claim that Irish workers in the Caribbean were slaves, in the same sense as African enslaved people. The truth, however, is more complex. African slavery was a lifelong hereditary system rooted in racial oppression, while Irish indentured servitude, though brutal, was temporary, and theoretically allowed the possibility of freedom. Recognizing this distinction does not diminish their suffering, it simply clarifies the historical reality, and allows us to honor each story authentically. Even in the harshness of daily labor, hope persisted. The young man imagined one day walking away from the fields, building a small life, maybe owning a plot of land, maybe starting a family. It was these fleeting visions that carried him through days of exhaustion and nights of worry, the promise of something better sustaining him when the weight of reality threatened to crush his spirit. As night fell, the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet. The young man lay beneath a tree, listening to the distant waves, reflecting on the journey that brought him here, and on the countless others who shared similar fates. History, he realized, was not just about events or laws. It was about human endurance, about the quiet courage required to survive each day against overwhelming odds. The truth of the Caribbean plantation experience is layered and complex. Irish indentured workers suffered deeply, yet their experiences were part of a broader network of labor systems that included African slavery. Both carried suffering, resilience, and courage, but the distinctions are crucial for accurate understanding. Recognizing these realities honors all who endured and ensures that human stories are not lost in oversimplified narratives. And as the stars lit the sea, Arabian sky, the young man closed his eyes, imagining distant Ireland, the fields behind him, and the uncertain path ahead. His story, like so many others, remains a testament to survival, hope, and the enduring human spirit. An unspoken truth history has long tried to hide, waiting for those willing to see, listen, and remember. The sky had darkened early, a storm rolling in from the open sea, heavy clouds casting the plantation into a shadow that felt almost permanent. The young Irish man stood at the edge of the fields, rain beginning to sprinkle over him, soaking the edges of his torn clothing. Every gust of wind carried the smell of wet earth, salt from the nearby coast, and the faint smoke of distant fires where the overseers burned debris. The plantation seemed endless, stretching across hills and valleys, each row of sugarcane a reminder of the relentless labor demanded from those who had no choice but to endure. Cinematic killer hook. First 5 to 7 seconds, the storm was coming. And so was the truth history tried to bury. Every drop of rain felt like a question: who survived, who suffered, and who remembered? The young man's hands were blistered, his muscles screaming from the unending work. Sweat mixed with rain, dirt, and grime, forming a layer over skin already hardened by months of labor. Around him, families huddled under thin shelter, trying to protect children from both the weather and the endless demands of the overseers. Their eyes told stories that words could never fully capture: fear, resilience, exhaustion, and a quiet determination that refused to break completely. The storm intensified, wind whipping the cane stalks into motion, creating an almost hypno-tick rhythm. It was a reminder of nature's own indifference to human suffering. The young man paused, listening to the distant thunder, feeling a mixture of awe and dread. Survival had become a daily challenge, measured not in years or seasons, but in hours and minutes. Each sunrise brought the weight of expectation. Each sunset offered little relief beyond exhaustion and bruised hope. Historians describe the lives of these Irish indentured servants as legally temporary, yet practically harsh and often deadly. Contracts existed, promising freedom after a set number of years, but disease, overwork, and the harsh environment meant that not everyone lived to see that day. To the young man, these legal distinctions felt irrelevant. Life on the plantation was brutal, and the possibility of freedom was a distant glimmer, almost intangible against the constant demands of work and survival. Yet, even in such darkness, moments of humanity emerged. A shared piece of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, the small kindness of one person toward another. These were the threads that held together the fragile fabric of their endurance. People looked to each other, not as mere co-workers, but as fellow humans facing the same relentless tide of hardship. These small acts were proof that even in the most oppressive systems, human spirit could not be entirely extinguished. The young man thought often of home, of the green hills of Ireland, the warmth of family, and the small comforts of a life left behind. Those memories, though faint, became a source of strength. They reminded him that even in forced labor, even in the face of exhaustion and fear, there was a reason to survive. And as the storm broke fully, rain pouring over the fields, he allowed himself a quiet hope that enduring this would not be the end of his story. Modern narratives sometimes claim that Irish indentured servants were slaves, equating their suffering directly with African slavery. Yet historians caution against this simplification. African slavery in the Caribbean was lifelong, hereditary, and racially codified. Irish indentures, while brutal, were temporary and legally structured to allow eventual freedom. Understanding these distinctions does not lessen the trauma endured by the Irish. It clarifies the history and honors all human suffering without distortion. As the storm raged on, the young man moved through the fields, rain pelting his back, each step a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. Children played quietly in puddles formed along the cane rows, their laughter fragile but persistent. Mothers whispered encouragements, elders offered guidance in hushed tones, and through it all, a sense of quiet perseverance prevailed. Even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit found ways to endure. The plantation was a place of suffering, yes, but it was also a place where courage, solidarity, and hope quietly persisted. Every story of survival, every act of endurance, became part of a larger narrative, one that history often simplifies but never truly forgets. The storm eventually began to recede, leaving the fields glistening under the muted light of a Caribbean sunset. The young man paused once more, looking toward the distant horizon, imagining a life beyond these fields, beyond the constant labor and fear. Though the journey ahead remained uncertain, the determination in his eyes mirrored that of countless others who had endured before him. History is not simple. It is lived through the struggles, resilience, and quiet acts of courage of people like this young man. Their stories remind us that understanding the past requires patience, empathy, and attention to the human details often lost in broader narratives. And as night fell over the plantation, the young man finally rested, aware that his survival mattered, not just for himself, but for the memory of those who endured alongside him. The rain had washed the fields, but it could not wash away their stories. Each drop, each moment of struggle, each act of perseverance would ripple through time, waiting for those willing to look closely and truly listen. The sun was barely rising, but the Caribbean air was already thick and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth, salt from the ocean, and the faint smoke of distant fires. The young Irishman moved slowly through the plantation fields, every step sinking slightly into the damp soil, muscles screaming from exhaustion, hands blistered and raw from long hours of labor. The wind whipped his torn clothing against his back, and he could feel the oppressive weight of the sky pressing down on the endless rows of sugarcane. Cinematic killer hook, first 5 to 7 seconds. The plantation was alive, not with birds or laughter, but with history itself. Every step, every drop of sweat, every silent scream carried centuries of untold stories waiting to be heard. Around him, families moved like shadows, bending to the sun, stooping over fields that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Mothers whispered to children, offering comfort that could barely touch the reality of the work ahead. Fathers kept their heads low, focusing on each task, every movement dictated by overseers whose eyes seemed to pierce every thought. The young man paused for a moment, taking in the vastness of his surroundings, feeling the crushing reality of being so far from home, so far from anyone who could understand his fear and pain. Rain began to fall lightly, mixing with the sweat and grime that coated every worker. It was cold against his skin, shocking, yet oddly invigorating, a small reminder that he was still alive. Each drop seemed to carry a message. Survival was possible, even here, even now, against a system that demanded everything from those who had nothing. Life on the plantation was harsh beyond words. The young man's body was pushed to its limits daily, carrying heavy loads, bending under the heat of the sun, navigating the sharp edges of sugarcane, all under the watchful gaze of overseers. Mistakes were punished. Weakness was not tolerated. Each day blurred into the next, a continuous cycle of labor, exhaustion, and fleeting moments of rest. Yet even in this relentless routine, small acts of humanity persisted. Shared water, quiet encouragement, a hand offered to help another stand. These tiny gestures were threads of hope, fragile but unbreakable, woven into the fabric of survival. Historians describe Irish indentured servants in the Caribbean as part of a legal system designed to provide labor in exchange for eventual freedom. Contracts existed, but the harshness of climate, disease, and unrelenting labor often made survival a precarious promise rather than a guarantee. For the young man, the distinction between legal contract and slavery seemed irrelevant. Survival was the only measure that mattered, and hope, no matter how small, was the most valuable currency. He remembered Ireland, the green hills, the warmth of home, the comfort of familiar voices, and clung to those memories as a lifeline. Each recollection was a spark in the darkness, a reason to endure the punishing days and the long, sleepless nights. Around him, children worked tirelessly, older siblings guiding the younger, whispering lessons in endurance and resilience. Families huddled together at night, sharing stories, songs, and prayers, maintaining fragments of their identity and humanity amidst the brutal demands of plantation life. Modern discussions sometimes claim that Irish indentured workers were slaves in the same sense as Africans, but historians caution against oversimplification. African slavery in the Caribbean was lifelong, hereditary, and racially codified. Irish indentured servitude, though harsh and often brutal, was temporary and legally structured to allow eventual freedom. Recognizing this distinction does not diminish Irish suffering but clarifies history, allowing each story to be honored authentically. The young man pressed forward, hands gripping tools that felt heavier with each passing hour. Sweat ran into his eyes, mixing with the rain, yet he continued. Each step became a testament to endurance, each breath a quiet act of rebellion against despair. In the distance, other workers moved in unison, forming a human rhythm of perseverance and shared struggle. They survived together, small acts of solidarity binding them more tightly than chains ever could. As night fell, the storm clouds dissipated, leaving a soft glow over the fields. The young man paused at the edge of the plantation, looking toward the horizon where the Caribbean Sea met the sky. He had survived the ocean, the ship, and the relentless labor of the plantati. On. His story, like thousands of others, became a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure. Every hardship, every moment of fear, every small act of courage carried forward a legacy that history could never fully erase. History is not simply dates and events, it is lived experience, shaped by resilience, courage, and hope. The young Irishman's journey reminds us that behind every label, indentured servant, laborer, survivor, there is a human story, waiting to be understood, honored, and remembered. And as the stars emerged over the Caribbean night, his story, like countless others, echoed silently across time, a quiet yet powerful testament to survival, endurance, and the human spirit that refuses to be broken. The storm was not just in the sky, it was in every heartbeat, every whispered prayer, every step taken under a sun and soil that demanded everything from those who had nothing to give. The plantation workers moved like shadows through the rain, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, eyes wide with fatigue yet holding sparks of determination. Mothers shielded their children as best they could, offering comfort through whispered words that barely touched the reality of what awaited them each day. Fathers kept silent, focusing on the labor at hand, knowing that any falter could bring punishment, and that their survival, and the survival of their families, depended on their endurance. Lightning flashed, illuminating the endless fields, casting fleeting shadows of exhausted figures bent under impossible weight. The young man paused, looking at the horizon where the storm met the distant sea. He thought of Ireland, the land left behind, the family and village he might never see again. Memories became both a burden and a lifeline, a reminder of home and of why enduring this unrelenting labor mattered at all. Rain poured harder, soaking the workers to the skin, mixing with sweat and dirt to create a coating that marked each person as a survivor of their own private struggle. Life on the plantation was measured not in days or months, but in moments of survival. Every sunrise brought the promise of relentless work. Every sunset offered only brief relief before the next day demanded the same endurance. Historians describe Irish indentured servants as part of a legal framework intended to allow eventual freedom, yet the reality of survival was cruel and unforgiving. Contracts were written on paper, but disease, exhaustion, harsh discipline, and the unrelenting climate meant that freedom was uncertain for many. To those living it, the distinctions between indentured servitude and slavery were often invisible. Survival was the only measure that mattered. Yet even in the darkness of these fields, small moments of human connection endured. A shared drink of water, a whispered word of encouragement, a hand offered in quiet solidarity, all became lifelines. These tiny acts of humanity created bonds among workers, weaving a fragile network of hope that allowed them to endure. They reminded the young man and those around him that even in the harshest systems, courage, resilience, and empathy could survive. Modern interpretations sometimes claim that Irish indentured servants were equivalent to slaves. equating their suffering with that of African enslaved people. The truth is more nuanced. African slavery in the Caribbean was lifelong, hereditary, and codified by race, while Irish servitude was temporary, contractual, and allowed the possibility of freedom. Recognizing this distinction does not diminish the suffering endured. It contextualizes history accurately, honoring every life authentically. The young man trudged through the mud, each step a testament to endurance, each breath a small victory. Around him, others moved in a silent rhythm of perseverance, sharing the burden of work and the weight of fear. They endured together, relying on solidarity, small acts of kindness, and the human spirit's stubborn refusal to break under pressure. As night fell and the storm began to ease, the plantation was left glistening under the dim glow of the moon. The young man paused at the edge of the fields, gazing toward the distant horizon where the ocean met the sky. He had survived the sea, the ship, and the unforgiving labor of the plantation. Each hardship, each day of exhaustion, each moment of despair carried with it a lesson of resilience and quiet courage. History is never simple. It is lived through human struggle, endurance, and hope. The Irish indentured workers who faced the Caribbean plantation system endured suffering and yet found ways to maintain their humanity. Their stories remind us that behind every label, servant, laborer, survivor, there is a human story demanding recognition, compassion, and remembrance. And as the first light of dawn pierced through the dissipating storm clouds, the young man inhaled deeply, feeling rain, mud, and wind on his skin. He had survived another day. His story, like those of countless others, carried forward the legacy of endurance, courage, and hope, a truth that history cannot erase, waiting for those willing to witness and remember it fully. The storm didn't just rage above, they felt it inside. Every heartbeat, every labored breath, every soaked, blistered hand carried the weight of a past the world tried to forget. Lightning split the sky, illuminating rows of exhausted figures moving like shadows through the rain. Mothers clutched children tightly, shielding them as best they could from the elements and the harsh gaze of overseers. Fathers worked silently, heads down, every movement calculated, knowing that hesitation could bring punishment and that the only path forward was relentless endurance. The young Irishman paused, watching the horizon where the storm met the distant sea, his mind flickering to memories of green hills, warm fires, and familiar voices from a life that felt impossibly distant. The storm intensified. Rain turned into sheets of water, mixing with sweat and mud, coating bodies in a slick, heavy layer that weighed down every movement. Work continued, relentless and unforgiving. Each day measured not in hours, but in moments of survival. Each sunrise brought the threat of exhaustion. Each sunset offered only fleeting relief before labor demanded again. The young man's mind wrestled with despair. Yet in small corners of the field, fragments of hope persisted, whispered encouragements, a shared loaf of bread, a quiet touch to steady a fellow worker. These acts became lifelines, fragile threads binding the human spirit together against overwhelming odds. Historians describe these Irish indentured servants as part of a legal system that promised eventual freedom. Yet reality often made survival uncertain. Disease, exile, scion, and harsh punishment rendered many contracts meaningless in practice. The young man could barely grasp distinctions on paper. Survival itself was the only law that mattered. Life on the plantation was not just hard, it was a test of endurance against both man and nature. Each moment a quiet act of rebellion against despair. Even in this chaos, humanity persisted. Children laughed quietly despite exhaustion, elders shared whispered wisdom, and families clung to each other, creating a fragile network of care in the face of overwhelming hardship. Every gesture, no matter how small, was proof that the human spirit could endure even in systems designed to dehumanize. Modern narratives sometimes claim that Irish workers were slaves, equating their experience with African slavery. African slavery was permanent, hereditary, and racially codified, while Irish indentured servitude, though brutal, was temporary, legally structured, and allowed the possibility of freedom. Understanding these distinctions does not diminish Irish suffering, but clarifies the historical record and honors all lives authentically. The young man pressed forward, each step a testament to resilience. Around him, others moved in silent rhythm, surviving together through solidarity and courage. The storm became almost symbolic, a force beyond their control, yet one they faced with persistence. Each strike of wind, each lashing of rain, each flash of lightning mirrored the relentless oppression they endured daily. Night fell, the storm finally easing into a heavy drizzle. The plantation glistened under the muted moonlight, the air thick with moisture, salt, and the lingering scent of human struggle. The young man paused at the edge of the fields, breathing deeply, feeling the mud beneath his feet, the rain on his skin, the wind in his hair. He had survived the sea, the ship, and the unyielding plantation. Each hardship, each moment of pain, each fleeting act of courage carried the unspoken story of thousands who had endured before him. History is not simply dates, names, or events. It is lived experience. It is the courage to continue when hope is fragile, the perseverance of those trapped in systems that demand everything, and the resilience of the human spirit. The young Irishman's journey reminds us that every indentured worker, every laborer, every survivor carried a story worthy of remembrance. As dawn finally broke, casting pale light over the storm-slicked fields, the young man gazed toward the horizon. His body ached, his hands were blistered, yet he stood tall, a living testament to survival, endurance, and the human spirit. His story, like thousands of others, echoed silently across time, a quiet yet powerful reminder that even in the face of relentless cruelty and unyielding storms, hope, courage, and dignity could survive. And as the first sun rays touched the distant sea, the lesson was clear. History belongs not only to those who wrote it, but to those who lived it. And their stories, no matter how buried or forgotten, demand to be seen, heard, and remembered. Conclusion 8. Complete. Hurricane-level Caribbean storm cinematic storytelling, survival struggle, natural human voiceover ready, 2K plus words, US audience friendly, YouTube monetization safe, pauses and pacing for narration included. If you want, I can now make conclusion 9, which will be the penultima. Climax, combining intense emotional payoff, survival reflection, and cinematic closure for the series. Do you want me to proceed? This was more than survival. It was endurance against a world determined to break them, a test of courage that no history book could fully capture. The plantation stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of labor and suffering. Mothers shielded children, whispering stories of home, of Ireland, of a past life that seemed more like a dream with each passing day. Fathers moved silently, their bodies bent under impossible weight, eyes scanning for signs of danger or disapproval from overseers. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to preserve life in a system designed to exhaust it. The young man paused for a moment, taking in the vastness of the fields and the storm-ravaged sky, the weight of isolation pressing down harder than the wind or the rain. Life on the plantation was unrelenting. Days were measured in hours of labor, nights in restless sleep on hard, wet ground. Mistakes brought punishment, fatigue brought vulnerability, and yet, even in these conditions, the human spirit persisted. Workers shared bread, whispered encouragement, and offered quiet gestures of care. Each act became a lifeline, a thread of hope connecting them in a world built to strip away every ounce of humanity. Historians often describe Irish indentured servants as legally bound but temporary laborers, yet survival was never guaranteed. Disease, exhaustion, and the harshness of climate made freedom uncertain. To those living it, contracts were words on paper. Endurance was the law. African slavery in the Caribbean, in contrast, was permanent, hereditary, and racially codified. Understanding these distinctions is crucial. It honors the suffering of all while clarifying the historical record. The young man thought of Ireland, the green hills, the warm hearths, the voices of family long gone. These memories, fragile and fleeting, became a source of strength. Children moved quietly beside him, their small hands gripping tools heavier than they should manage, eyes wide with both fear and determination. Families huddled at night, sharing whispered songs, prayers, and stories, preserving their identity and humanity amidst unimaginable hardship. As the storm subsided, a soft drizzle fell, and the fields glistened under the emerging sun. The young man pressed forward, each step a testament to resilience, each breath a quiet act of rebellion against despair. Around him, others moved in silent rhythm, surviving together through solidarity and courage. Every strike of wind, every flash of lightning from the previous nights, every soaked step became a symbol of endurance against forces beyond their control. Even in the harshest conditions, hope persisted. The young man imagined finishing his contract, starting a life of his own, building a home, perhaps raising children. These fleeting visions became lifelines, sustaining him through days of exhaustion and nights of worry. His survival was not just physical. It was a testament to human courage, resilience, and the ability to endure against overwhelming odds. Modern debates sometimes blur these experiences, claiming equivalence between Irish indentured servitude and African slavery. The truth is more nuanced. Both suffered deeply, but the systems were different in law, permanence, and racial codification. Acknowledging this distinction does not diminish Irish suffering. It clarifies history and allows every story to be honored with accuracy and empathy. As night fell, the young man paused at the edge of the fields, looking toward the distant horizon where the sea met the sky. He had survived the ocean voyage, the harsh labor, and the unforgiving plantation. His body ached, but his spirit remained unbroken. The countless acts of courage, endurance, and solidarity around him carried the stories of thousands, echoing silently across generations. History is not simply a record of events. It is the lived experience of those who endured, who survived, who hoped when hope seemed impossible. The young Irishman's journey reminds us that every indentured worker, every laborer, every survivor carries a story worth remembering. Their endurance is a testament to the human spirit, a truth that history cannot erase. And as the first rays of the Caribbean sun touched the glistening fields, he inhaled deeply, feeling the wind, rain, and mud on his skin. His story, like thousands of others, persisted, a quiet but powerful reminder that survival, resilience, and dignity can endure even in the face of relentless hardship. Seconds, this was the moment history almost forgot, the story of endurance, suffering, and quiet courage that survived storms, oppression, and time itself. Around him, the plantation seemed almost alive, swaying sugarcane, damp earth, and the soft hum of those who survived the night. Mothers comforted children, whispering memories of home. Fathers moved with careful determination, teaching the young and guiding them through the endless rhythm of labor. Every gesture, every shared look, every silent act of care became a testament to the persistence of the human spirit. The young man remembered Ireland, the green hills, warm fires, voices of family he might never see again. Yet those memories were not just nostalgia. They were lifelines, reminding him why survival mattered. Children worked tirelessly beside him, learning endurance through observation, every small act a building block of resilience. Families huddled in evenings, sharing whispered songs, prayers, and stories. preserving fragments of identity in a world designed to erase it. Life on the plantation was brutal. Days were measured in labor, nights in restless sleep, mistakes punished, weakness exploited, contracts promised eventual freedom, but disease, exhaustion, and harsh discipline often made survival uncertain. African slavery, by contrast, was permanent, hereditary, and racially codified. Irish indentured servitude, while harsh, was temporary and legally structured. Understanding these distinctions honors both realities without diminishing the suffering endured. Even in darkness, hope persisted. The young man envisioned completing his contract, starting a small life, perhaps raising children in a world freer than the one that had shaped him. These visions sustained him through exhaustion, fear, and despair. His survival was more than physical. It was proof of courage, resilience, and the human capacity to endure beyond expectation. The plantation's rhythms continued, silent but telling. Workers moved in coordinated endurance, weathering storms, oppressive sun, and unyielding overseers together. Each act of solidarity, sharing water, offering encouragement, or simply enduring side by side, was a quiet rebellion against dehumanization. Every small gesture became part of a larger narrative, one that history often simplifies but never fully erases. Modern debates blur the lines between Irish indentured servitude and African slavery. Both were harsh, both included suffering, but systems differed in permanence, legality, and racial codification. Recognizing this distinction preserves historical accuracy and ensures that every story receives the respect it deserves. As the sun fully emerged, illuminating the fields, the young man took a deep breath. He had survived the Atlantic crossing, relentless plantation labor, storms, disease, and despair. He had endured beyond what seemed humanly possible. Around him, countless others had done the same, each silently carrying their own stories of courage and endurance. History is lived, not just written. It is endured through the struggles, resilience, and quiet acts of courage of those who experienced it. The young Irish man's journey reminds us that every laborer, every indentured worker, every survivor is more than a statistic. They are a story of hope, perseverance, and human spirit. And as the Caribbean sun rose fully over the glistening fields, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling wind, rain, mud, and life itself on his skin. His story, like thousands of others, carried forward into memory, a testament to survival, dignity, and resilience. The plantation may have tested him, the storms may have tried to break him, but he, and the human spirit he represented, endured. This was the final chapter, not an end, but a continuation, a quiet, unbroken testament to courage, a legacy of survival, and a story history can no longer afford to forget.